We're back at it after a 2-week hiatus, diving right into the numbers. We're going to be talking a little bit later on about the US inflation numbers that were surprising on the positive end for the US. But before we get into that, we want to talk first about the UK GDP numbers and also the German trade balance. So maybe let's start with the German trade balance. The numbers came out this week that Germany is still in a surplus. They actually rose in their surplus that after they revised it marginally, they were already in a surplus. What that kind of means for the listeners is it means that they exported more goods than they imported. So maybe you can give some thoughts on that situation in Germany.
Yeah, I mean, the situation in Germany is still not super positive, but it is turning around a little bit. But exports and imports went down. They both fell, but imports fell more than exports.
Yeah.
So it is a good sign that they have still a strong exporting industry, because there is a lot of knowledge. There are a lot of engineers in Germany. They do great work, and so the products are needed. But it also shows the consumer sentiment within the Europe, or within Germany in particular, that the demand for foreign goods, I would say, and services is coming down, or is still down, and it will be interesting when this turns around again.
Yeah, especially the appetite of the German public. Like, why is that they don't want as much foreign goods? Are they just turning towards more German products, or are they just trying to save more in general as an economy in terms of the population? It's also interesting to see in Germany that their inflation is also headed down close to that 2%. I think they're around 2.4, 2.2%, somewhere around there. So that inflation is really coming back closer to the target of what Germany is looking for.
Yeah, I think that really the population is very insecure about the future, and that they, from their culture, they are quite conservative anyway, and so they want to save more money to just be sure that they have some kind of a nest egg to use when it really comes to the point that they need it. And we also see, I mean, that was a comparison I did in the newsletter, is that in Germany, like 17% of the population, they are invested at the stock markets, while in the US it's 63%. So you see that the risk appetite in Germany is much less or more conservative than in the US or in other countries.
Yeah, especially coming off the back of a recession. That's sitting
Right.
on Germans' minds as they're, pulling, as the economy is coming out of the recession, heading into better times. They still have a fresh memory of a recession. And so that's kind of in the population. And with that, we can kind of shift over to the GDP numbers coming out of the UK. So annualized, their GDP grew by 1.4%, which is interesting to see. Again, another nation coming out of a recession. Inflation there is also headed back towards its 2%, within the like 2.5, I think. So there you also see the economy kind of struggling, especially, or not struggling, but coming out of that struggling, moving in the right direction. They also had their elections on July 4th, a little bit of a spit in the face to Americans. But at the same time, it's interesting to see, how their country is navigating this whole process.
Yeah, it's also interesting to see what the outcome was of the election. It went more to the Labour Party is now in power, while the Tories were before. There was the more conservative party. And I don't really think that the parties have so much power that they can turn around like the business cycles. That's my belief in general, that whatever party is in place, that a lot of things, especially in the economy, are also happening just because of how the business cycle works. But obviously, there will be some changes on the regulatory side. And it also shows the frustration within the public, or within the nation, among the citizens. And I mean, the Tories have been in power for a long time, I think almost 15 years or so. And now it's just like the other party who has a chance to make things better. Whether they will achieve doing that, it's up to the future to decide.
Sure.
But I think that people were suffering a lot in Great Britain as well, and that they are coming out of the recession, and it will not have too much of an impact what party is in power at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, the economy themselves, the market players, the business people, the companies, the entrepreneurs, they are going to have that real strong effect, in terms of how the economy comes out. Of course, governments have, the power to put in regulation that can affect portions of their economy. But at the end, it's about the fortitude of the people inside the country. And I think England has a good or an interesting road in front of them. And if they navigate it well, can really lead them to a great place in terms of how they've set their country up and in which path that they go. So with that, let's shift over to the U.S. Inflation data came out. We saw I think it's the third month now that its inflation has ticked down. It's at 3% year over year, I believe.
I think 3.1 wasn't
it? 3.1. Yeah, three. I think one of those. 3.1, 3.3%. Either way, it's ticked down a bit.
Right.
Even month over month, it's ticked down. So that's quite interesting to see. It was the CPI numbers that were also interesting, that had been essentially flat since 2020, and that also ticked down slightly.
It went up first and then it didn't come down really. So now it's coming down, and I think it also gives a little bit of a picture of how the consumers do, because what is a huge part of the CPI number, the consumption, what is it?
Consumer Price Index.
Consumer Price Index, there we go, is also the consumption of the people. As long as they consume, prices are going higher and higher. And then at some point, people say, no, too much is too much. We are not going to consume any further. And there are some products and services where they can do that. There are all like food and energy where they can't really. And we also see that within the inflation numbers that, for example, like at the gas stations, prices are still accelerating or going up, while in other areas they are coming down again.
Yeah, and it's interesting to look at those the gas numbers. If you look at the crude oil reserves, this last month, the U.S. had a negative like 12 million barrels in terms of a reduction of 12 million barrels in crude oil, which is crazy to see. So that they're using their stock reserves to just keep, I guess, to a certain extent, gas prices from accelerating too fast.
Right.
I was just in the States, and it was amazing to see how cheap it is in comparison to Switzerland.
Yeah.
But at the same time, looking at the numbers and going, oh man, yeah, there's some challenges here still inside of the economy despite it falling.
Well, you were in Colorado. I was in California recently, and in California, our prices for gas are still pretty high compared to other states.
Yes.
And there are two reasons why the oil reserves decrease. One reason is because economic activity is increasing by a lot, but that's not what we are seeing. We're seeing that a lot of companies, other like than the big Magnificent Seven, that they are struggling and that the demand really isn't there. And then the other reason why oil consumption or oil reserves are decreasing is what you said, that the government tries to keep gas prices lower, and there are certain areas or certain periods where that makes sense. For example, before an election. So
yeah, it's always I love that. I love that comment, because always in the election, that's always one of the hot button issues.
Right.
On either side, whoever's the incumbent, the other side wants the gas prices to rise, because then it's the common person's way of saying my expenses are increasing.
Right.
And so this hurts. And so it is interesting to see that kind of shift in where it's going. I think the other side, maybe just a little interesting tidbit, is that the U.S. revised their GDP numbers down a lot.
Quite a bit,
not just a small number. And that also kind of shows like where we're seeing Europe accelerating, we're seeing the U.S. decelerating in terms of their economic cycle, their business cycle. And so that's going to be something to really keep our eyes on as we move forward.
Yeah, and at the same time, you also see how insecure the situation is, because Fed's President Sharon Powell had to testify, be in front of the House, and the outcome was very disappointing for a lot of experts or analysts, because he didn't say anything really. He was just like, yeah, we have to see what the future brings, and then we have to decide on the data we have.
Which was super fascinating, before we end this, to see that the media was saying, oh yeah, for like all the headlines were, there will be a rate cut soon, Jerome Powell's statements. But when you actually get into what he said, and you see what he said before Congress, he didn't say anything about we're going to cut rates or we're going to raise rates. He was essentially neutral, didn't give any kind of signal. And at the same time, the media, or at least somehow the people, want it so bad that that's what they're trying to push.
Correct.
Cool. So that's it for this week. Next week, we're going to cover the GDP growth rate of China, as well as the European Central Bank has their interest rate decision.
Wonderful.